Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first of our webinar series on planning and financing metropolitan governments. My name is Mansha Chen, and I'm from the Urban Practice of the World Bank Institute. We are very pleased to have about 40 people joining us today, an indication of growing interest on this topic. I'm sure more people will log in at a later time. This webinar series is the result of a collaboration between the World Bank and the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, and is structured around chapters of Lincoln Institute's recent publication titled Financing Metropolitan Governments in Developing Countries. It provides a unique entry point to engage cities who are addressing the complex task of financing infrastructure and services across jurisdictional boundaries. The webinar series will be held every other Tuesday from October to April 2014 at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The list of topics could be found in our Institute website. We are very honored to have Professor Roy Bao as our presenter today. Roy Bao is the Regents Professor of Economics from Georgia State University. He will present an overview on financing metropolitan governments, the way forward, and introduce the major themes to be covered throughout the series. Let me briefly introduce Professor Roy Bao. An expert in public finance, Bao has consulted on fiscal matters with governments in developing and transition economies all over the world, as well as with the International Monetary Fund, the Asian Development Bank, the U.S. Agency for International Development, the United Nations, and the World Bank. Bao headed the staffs of the Ohio and Georgia Tax Commissions. He served as principal economic advisor to IBM's worldwide tax practice. Bao is the author of numerous books, monographs, and scholarly papers in the area of urban regional economics, public finance, and economic development. He has served on the editorial boards of the National Tax Journal, the Journal of Public Budgeting and Finance, and Growth and Change. He is the author of the book Fiscal Policy in China, and with Johannes Lin of Urban Public Finance in Developing Countries. He came to Georgia State from Syracuse University, where he was the director of the Metropolitan Studies program and Maxwell Professor of Political Economy. Without further ado, let me invite Professor Roy to start his presentation.
Hello, everyone. I'm so glad to be here today. I have a limited time to talk with you, so let me get right into this. Some of you will remember that Johannes Lin, then of the World Bank, and I did a book about 20 years ago on urban public finance in developing countries. And ever since then, he and I have been talking about the need to do it again because urbanization would sooner or later proceed rapidly and the story would be different. So finally, he and I and Debbie Wetzel, who's now the World Bank Country Director in Brazil, edited a volume with 13 invited essays that we thought really were on the mark in terms of what was happening in this area. The book came out this year, and it's available. And this center, this lecture really is based on that book. And what I'm doing today is talking with you about the first chapter, which the three of us wrote. And all that I talk about is covered in greater depth in the book. So let me start on this. And I think I'm sure I'm going to run out of time before I finish. So let me begin with the punchline, where I get to at the end. What did we learn from all of this? And I think that there were three big lessons. The first of the big lessons is is to think metropolitan, to develop a metropolitan strategy. Too long we've been locked into boundaries of municipalities and service areas of special district. It's long past the time that we should think metropolitan, and we have to somehow marry how planners think about the world, which is in terms of coherent economic units or labor market areas, and how politicians think about the world, which has to do with the boundaries of governments. And so we need to begin by thinking about metropolitan. And the reasons why are so clear, aren't they? I mean, the externalities associated with the provision of services, things related to pollution, solid waste, transport, water, open the door to think about regional taxing districts and regional expenditure delivery systems, and try to get back to this notion that metropolitan areas ought to be more self-sufficient in their financing. The second big lesson is really about sequencing. See, here's the story in the past. The story in the past is finance follows function. That is, you can't really get the finances right if you don't organize the functional responsibilities of the governments first. Otherwise, the story never ends. If you start with the revenue side, you never have the right balance between revenues and expenditures. But what we say is that even before you can do the expenditure assignment, you've got to understand the governance side. So the new rule, really, we think, is finance follows function, follows governance. For example, if you have a metropolitan government, you can begin to think about a regional tax or a regional service delivery. But if you have a fragmented local government structure with many metropolitan areas, you can't even begin to think about those options. Governance is harder to change than expenditure assignments. It may even be constitutional. So governance is where you start. How are we going to organize the metropolitan government? And finally, pay more attention to the constraints on good practice, the most important of which is local politics. And the local politics vary from country to country, but they are terribly important. We may find, you and I, as students of the subject, that a fragmented local government structure is not in the best interest of metropolitan governments. And we may be very sure that we ought to get rid of these fragmented structures. But home rule dies very slowly, and it's hard to get past that. The same, we may decide that there's too much interference from a higher level government in terms of service delivery or planning, or maybe not enough. But that raises some questions about conflict between provincial or central government ministries and metropolitan local governments. So the political constraints are very great on what can be done, and it kind of changes our story about best practice. And so as we talk today, we'll continue to return to these three themes. Develop a metropolitan area-wide strategy. Think about it a different way. Get the sequencing right. Finance follows function, follows governance. And finally, factor in the political constraints to all of the reform options. And so that's kind of the bottom line of the book, and you'll hear that as we march through this thing. A few comments on trends that are worldwide. It's very hard for anyone to talk about a particular country because things are different from country to country. But if we take sort of national numbers, just think about this. In 2012, there were 7 billion people in the world. In 2050, there will be 9 billion people in the world. That 2 billion, all of it will be absorbed into urban areas in developing countries. So that's kind of a way to place this issue on the policy agenda worldwide, and it's why all of the international agencies are showing concern on it. The particular concern we have are the big cities, more than 10 million. And you'll see from the overlay, there will be 27 of these in a few years, and 21 will be in the less developed countries. Also of interest, 3/4 of all the cities between 5 and 10 million will be in less developed countries. So the action is very heavily in urban areas and in finding a way to finance the infrastructure and services that are going to be needed by these people. I mean, goodness, think about China. Sometime over the next 20 years, about 200 million people are going to move to the urban areas in China. How in the world do you finance and provide services to that magnitude of people? So the big cities, the big metros, they can be a great blessing because they can be, as we often say, the drivers of economic growth. On the other hand, they can be a huge problem in terms of getting the right kind of governance and providing the right kind of services. Just examples of sort of the new things that we're going to talk about when we work on this as policy advisors. We're going to talk about clusters of metropolitan regions. We're going to talk about places like, well, in the United States, Baltimore and Washington growing together, and the New York metropolitan region. Or if we were in China, we would be talking about Guangzhou Pearl River, or we would be talking about Tianjin and Beijing. And so all over the world, these big urban agglomerations are growing together, and the spillover effects become huge issues that have to be dealt with by someone. And that's kind of new stuff. Declining densities and urban sprawl all over the world. We need to be careful because it reduces our ability as local governments to capture agglomeration effects, and it's costly as it can be. So that's an issue. And then how to deliver services. I mean, we're talking about places with 20 million people. How do you service a city that large? Right now, we're just beginning to understand what the route might be. And finally, how do you go green when you're so big? So there's a great deal to talk about. Now let's start with the issue of governance, and let's begin with the question of how much decentralization do we want within a metropolitan area. I see a lot of names that I know on the list who I know have worried about this question on a national scale. How much decentralization should there be? But let's drill down and ask, we have a large urban area with 10 million people or more. How much decentralization of governance is the right amount of decentralization within the metropolitan area, and how do we get there? And actually, we use the same kind of paradigm that we use in expenditure assignment to begin to ask and answer that question. The decentralization theorem, if you will, that all functions probably ought to be delivered by the smallest local government possible unless some efficiency conditions dictate that we should do it another way. So, for example, home rule. If we decide that the preferences of the local population is what matters most, it will drive us to a metropolitan area with a large number of small municipalities. And government, in effect, would be moved much closer to people. If we decide that our interest is more technical efficiency, then economies of scale would tell us that we ought to provide services to a wider area and to more people, and we would impose a cost on home rule. And then there are the questions of externalities. You can't really turn services over to municipal governments if there are going to be large spillover effects as a result of the decisions they make. And finally, equity. And the equity issue really is about the existence of very poor neighborhoods and very rich neighborhoods and middle class neighborhoods. And how in the world do you provide adequate services to all of these groups if you have a fragmented government structure? And we know people will cluster together based on their level of income. So equity becomes another issue. So we're kind of torn between technical efficiency and economic efficiency and equity in deciding what kind of a government structure we would have. Well, what happens? Well, what happens is that every country or every metropolitan area probably emphasizes something. They emphasize some form of governance more. And so, for example, under jurisdictional fragmentation, which would be a lot of small local governments operating within the metropolitan area, there are lots of examples of those kinds of places. Manila has made that choice with 17 municipalities that operate within a local government, within a metropolitan area. Sao Paulo, with something like 39 local governments. I think the world champion on fragmentation is probably Mexico City, metropolitan area, with a federal district, 2 states, and 59 municipal-like governments, all operating within the metropolitan area, but with relatively little coordination. On the other end is metropolitan governments, one big government operating to cover the entire metropolitan area. Good example would be South Africa, Johannesburg and Cape Town, which are governed that way. Metropolitan Mumbai, in a sense, is governed that way. But then there is a functional fragmentation. And functional fragmentation is the use of public companies that provide services on an area-wide basis. Water or transport companies are examples. And we would find this very heavily in the large metropolitan areas in Eastern Europe, where they use these public companies. And in most other countries, you do find some public companies. But what happens is that every country seems to try to deal with the problems of its fundamental choice by borrowing from the other two models. I'll tell you what I mean. Take the example of Manila. Manila fundamentally is a fragmented structure of local government, but there is a Metro Manila Authority with area-wide responsibilities superimposed on top of it. There's something similar to that operates in Kolkata. Sao Paulo is fragmented, but doesn't have a metropolitan government, but does try to work on the issue by providing for different methods of coordination among the local governments. The metropolitan governments, or the area-wide governments, usually are overlaid by public companies. In the case of Mumbai, they are parastatals. In the case of Cape Town, it may be provincial level government provision of services for particular services like transportation and water. So where we come down is that we have these relationships within local government areas that emphasize one function versus another. So if you study a Sao Paulo, you're going to come probably to the conclusion that it captures more economic efficiency, but it probably loses on the side of technical efficiency, and so on. Then there are the vertical arrangements. What do governments try to do, higher level governments try to do to resolve the problem? And it's sort of a struggle, a political struggle, but they do different things. I mean, in the United States, there's long been an argument about should local governments have more autonomy or should there be metro government. The local government side wins almost every time, and local government is very fragmented in the United States. But in Canada, Toronto just adopted a metropolitan government that appears to be working. In the case of a country like Philippines or a country like China, the argument is that even local government isn't small enough. So we see the sub-municipal governments begin to grow up. In the case of other countries, the idea may be to create a special provincial status for the larger cities. Buenos Aires, the 4 large cities in China, and so on. And so government structure looks very different around the world, and it's driven in part by this culture, the importance of home rule, and by politics. On the side of urban expenditure needs, we know that they are enormous. That the unmet needs in metropolitan areas and developing countries are quite large. I mean, you might kind of break them down this way: that the basic service levels are still not provided adequately in many large metropolitan areas. The minimum level of services certainly isn't provided in slums. We're told that sometime in the next decade, we may be looking at as many as 2 billion people living in slums in developing countries. And one definition of slums is that both shelter and services are below minimum standards. Wastewater, garbage, basic health security, and so on. Amenities is a second category, that people with a growing middle class and hopes for an even more rapidly growing middle class. People have more education, and people are demanding more amenities out of their government. And this includes pollution control, reducing congestion, schooling, green space, sprawl versus density, affordable homes, modern hospitals, you name it. The sort of public amenities that can be provided. And then there are the demands from industry and from commerce. And usually these fall in the area of infrastructure, where there's great need for transportation and communication, and even amenities for the employees that they would like to attract. And the argument is a strong one. The argument is that job creation really should take precedent over the provision of amenities in metropolitan areas. That's a hard argument that has to be faced. Management of large metropolitan areas is a very difficult subject. What do we know? We know that for a long time the argument was put in a very simple way, that subnational governments just don't have the capacity to deliver services at an adequate level, mostly because the civil service is of low quality. We've long since, I think, put that one down as too simplistic a discussion, and that the problems are tougher than that. That locals surely do have shortfalls in terms of the civil servant quality, but there are inadequate management and control systems that are more easily repaired. The systems themselves, the promotions, even the accounts and the budgetary arrangements. That the failure to capture economies of scale because of the structure of government is a problem. The imposition of expenditure mandates. Suppose the central government, take the case of India, suppose the central government has a wage commission that every X years lays down a recommendation for wage increase for central government employees, and this rolls out to the local level. It becomes a kind of an unfunded mandate. And don't pick on India. Lots and lots of countries leave this responsibility to higher level governments. Inadequate revenue and improper expenditure assignment. So urban government expenditure needs and urban government management needs become a major issue. Now, on the revenue side of things, it's probably the area where most people would rather work on reforming metropolitan public finance, and it's because it's a little more clear how you would work on the revenue side than it is on the expenditure side. I think that there's relatively little argument about what a good local tax is. A good local tax is one where, of course, where the local government has the right to at least set the tax rate. But a good local tax choice would be one where the burden was not exported to residents who live elsewhere. Otherwise, you would get the taxing jurisdiction overspending because it could shift the burden. And the administration has to be feasible. We have to be able to levy the tax at a reasonable cost. And then there is the question of revenue. That can we gain enough revenue from a local tax? So again, the question is, revenue assignment follows governance. That the kind of metropolitan governance you choose limits the kind of tax that you can choose. For example, if you choose a fragmented local government, if you're going to have a government with 25 municipalities operating within it, you have very limited number of choices of things you can do on the tax side. The best thing you can do is property and land taxes. You probably cannot do consumption or income-based taxes because you would end up exporting the tax burden. Take the case of Buenos Aires. Buenos Aires is a regional government. In effect, it's a provincial government, and that national capital district does levy a gross receipts tax. Even with a government that large, the tax has problems because of exporting of the burdens. But for small municipal jurisdictions, very tough for them to levy something other than a property or a land tax. But for a large regional government, it could be done. So if we turn to the case of the most popular of the local taxes, which is the property tax. Property tax is the mainstay of local government finance all over the world. It's the mainstay in the sense that everybody has a property tax. It's not the mainstay in the sense that it provides adequate revenue. Very few countries around the world have levied a high enough property tax to have it live up to its potential. Property tax has great advantages. The revenue base is broad. There's a lot of growth. It taxes wealth. It tends to be a progressive tax. It has good land use effects. It even acts as a kind of a benefits charge because a lot of the tax finances a lot of services that are benefit related. So what's to argue about the property tax? Why do local governments in developing countries raise only about 0.5% of GDP from this tax? And the answer is really costly to administer. Okay, the question of intergovernmental transfers. This is the primary source of revenues of subnational governments and of metropolitan governments. The question really is how do we structure transfers for metropolitan areas? And this is a whole new game. The idea is that we would like these metropolitan areas to be basically self-sufficient in terms of revenue raising and hold out most transfers to be equalization transfers to lower income places. But in order to do that, we would have to allocate a significant amount of revenues to the metropolitan governments, or at least revenue raising powers to the metropolitan governments. Only a few countries have done something like this. I think probably South Africa is the best example on one end, where they have put metropolitan governments in a position of having to raise most of their revenue. On the other end, the Chinese have given a huge amount of expenditure authority to the metropolitan area governments. They spend about 85% of the total amount of spending, but no revenue raising powers at all. And in between is everyone else who has done this in a different way. So sorting out what we're going to do about intergovernmental transfers in developing countries, metropolitan areas, is a subject that we've just begun to approach and have a lot of thinking to do. I believe my time is up.
Professor Roy, I think you can continue until 10:40, and we are going to skip the prepared question and go directly to the open questions after your presentation, if it's okay with you.
That would be fine with me. And then on the we have 5 more minutes. Let's talk some about this question of infrastructure finance, because it is of such great importance to most countries. And the issue is really, first of all, the magnitude of infrastructure finance needs. There's a lot of discussion about this. And note that infrastructure responsibilities are very heavily at the subnational government level. In this book that we're talking about, there's one set of projections of urban infrastructure needs, doing a kind of deterministic model. And the conclusion there is that the needs to maintain a steady state of infrastructure investment and maintenance is about 5% of GDP per year. That's just urban infrastructure needs. I saw more recently some estimates for the needs to address the issues in China on the urban investment side, and those estimates were 2.5% of GDP. I saw some estimates for India that were closer to 5% of GDP. And when you consider that governments, central and subnational governments in low-income countries only raise about 17% of GDP in taxes, then you get a sense of the magnitude of the infrastructure needs. And so the question is to find other routes. How do we find other routes in metropolitan areas to finance urban infrastructure? Now, the one that we talk about the most is borrowing. And the thing about borrowing is not a source of revenue at all. It's just a method of financing. Ultimately, it has to be paid. But the method of financing is important because you want the life of the financing instrument to be at least equal to the life of the asset that you're creating. And so this debate about borrowing in low-income countries swirls, and it swirls in part because our memories are pretty good about Brazil and Argentina, and so central governments are only willing to go very slow and very carefully in this area. So in theory, the wealthier metropolitan areas ought to be able to issue revenue bonds or general obligation bonds to finance infrastructure. There ought to be credit analysis that would protect investors, or at least advise investors. And then almost everyone argues that there should be some kind of fiscal rules, somehow placing limits on what a local government can borrow for and limits on the amount that they can borrow. And we know by now that there are lots and lots of different approaches that have been taken to this. But the financing options, how you would pay, whether you financed by a bond or whether you did it with more short-term financing, really are clear cut. In a metropolitan area, there could be local taxes, and local taxes could rely on property tax and income tax and consumption tax, and taxes like heavier taxes on motor vehicles. There's not much standing between productive local government revenues, the reality of local government revenues in metropolitan areas, except that higher level governments are very often unwilling to give the taxing powers to the local governments. So one solution for metropolitan finance would be for higher level governments to put the locals out on their own, hold them accountable, and require them to raise their own revenue from any one of a number of sources that could work very well. User and benefit charges, it's the solution that everyone has been enamored with for decades. The problem is that there's rarely cost recovery with user charges for essential services. Intergovernmental transfers is what we finally come back to, which is central government, in effect, paying the bill for the subnational governments by making a transfer to them, which doesn't really create much by way of accountability at the local level, and often comes with strings attached. Public-private partnerships work just fine when the services are not essential services. Unfortunately, it's the essential services where the subnational governments in metropolitan areas most want the investment. And here I'm thinking about water supply and wastewater treatment. The problem is the capacity of the local government and the willingness to assess an adequate level of user charges. And finally, sales of assets. It's not only used in China, but that's the one that has caught our attention in the last 10 years, where the Chinese local governments have sold state-owned land. Basically, they've sold the lease rights, the state-owned lands in the urban fringe, and have used the proceeds to invest heavily in urban infrastructure. And the results of that have been an astounding growth in investment in infrastructure on the one hand, but some huge problems in terms of the vulnerability of the local governments with respect to repayment of the loans that were taken, that were secured by land, and the fact that this system has stimulated urban sprawl. So it's a mixed bag on the sale of assets, at least in the case of the Chinese experience. That's my time. Host.
Thank you, Professor Roy, for the very insightful overview that walks us through some important themes on metropolitan public finance and mapped out the reform directions. Let's now open up for questions. Please type your question in the chat pod. Let's start with a question raised by Victor about data. Where data fits in the finance functions follows governance. How do you begin to govern metropolitan areas without reliable data? How do you build reliable data for policy making?
That's a really interesting question, and it's one of the great puzzles. First of all, there isn't any question but that we know how to put together a database that would allow governments, at least, to make better decisions. But it doesn't happen. I mean, the sometimes it doesn't happen because it's costly. Sometimes it's very hard to get the local governments to report in the same way. But if you were looking for a census of local governments where you could show the actual financial operations of every subnational government in the country, you would be hard pressed to find that information in many countries. Good examples are South Africa and Indonesia, where you could find that kind of information. In most industrial countries, you can find that information, but not in most low-income countries. And on top of everything else, it creates a huge problem for credit analysis when it comes to the debt financing. But having a database on the finances of local governments in low-income countries is well within reach right now. We know exactly how to do it, and it ought to be done.
There's an observation from Uma from Mumbai says that sales of assets is not considered an option in Mumbai. And they also feel that strong institutions are essential for using any of the options.
No, I agree. Certainly, I agree with the idea that the institution should be stronger. Let's talk about the assets. I mean, China was one that we mentioned. It's unusual because all land in China is owned by the state. So in effect, the state has an asset that it can use for purposes of sale. And you could think of it like you would think of a natural resource asset. The country would own an exhaustible resource, and it would basically take it out of the ground and sell it and hopefully turn it into infrastructure. You could even think about cash balances as a kind of an asset that could be used to finance current spending over the cycle. So countries are going to be very different in terms of their ability to sell assets. But institutions are of great importance. But it's when we say institutions, we mean, do we give the local governments, for example, the latitude to do what they need to do to finance services? Do they have the power and the willingness to move user charges to cost recovery levels, for example? But then we have to ask the question, do the local governments have the capacity to make use of that authority? So I think you're absolutely right. And if the local governments don't have the capacity, then the question is, how do we build it? Or do we simply continue to deliver that capacity by shifting it to a higher level government?
Related to that, there is a comment from Nine saying that one of the major sources of finance for Pune Municipal Corporation is octroi, now local body tax and premium charges for higher FSI.
Yeah, that's octroi is an interesting question, isn't it? On the one hand, uh, it fails all the tests of a good tax, just about. I mean, it's something that looks like it came from another time in history far ago. On the other hand, it raises a lot of money. And so when you replace a bad tax, one that is distortive, like the octroi, then it's incumbent on someone to replace it with some sort of a revenue source that yields an adequate amount of funding for the local government budget. And what very often happens is that governments are quick to abolish a bad tax, but not so quick to replace it with a proper tax. And you can find the same story in East Africa with respect to the graduated personal tax, and even in South Africa with respect to the elimination of certain taxes. So it's difficult, isn't it? And so the commissions are very, very quick to abolish, not so quick to find a proper replacement.
Michael asked a question about parking fee. He said in the High Cost of Free Parking 2005, Schub advocates setting the right price for curb parking and returning parking revenue to pay for local public services in the United States. In light of increased motorization in developing countries, what are metropolitan areas in the Global South doing to appropriately charge for parking and leverage this for revenue generation?
Well, there's two parts to that very good question. One part is the value of levying parking charges correctly, and I think almost everyone would agree that there's a great deal of uncaptured potential. The other question is, should the money be earmarked for certain kinds of transportation services? Sort of the same question about motor fuels. I think that if you look around the world for the heavy use and successful use of parking taxes, I don't find too many cases where there has been great success with that. I think in some parts of China there has been with heavier use of parking taxes, and I suppose in Singapore and Hong Kong. In terms of whether they should be earmarked for transportation services, I think that's a tougher question, whether it's a general revenue. And it seems to me that the case is awfully strong that it is a general revenue.
There's a question asked by Oliver about city credit worthiness. How important is a good credit rating at the city level? And can you talk about country to country differences?
In credit ratings, yeah, it depends on the borrowing scheme. If the borrowing is going to be from central government agencies, then the credit rating becomes the external credit rating becomes less important. If the borrowing is going to be from the market, then in effect it's everything. But the credit that depends on the credibility of the credit rating, and it depends on whether the repayment of the loan is going to be backed by the central government. So you take a case like Mexico, where there is in effect, probably not the right word, but in effect a kind of an intercept arrangement that's been put in place that protects the lender. So in that sort of a case, the credit rating is important. The lender would like to know what's the probability that they're going to have to make use of the intercept. But it's not as important as in the case where a local government is on its own and has to borrow from the market based on its credit strength, like in the case of the United States, in which case the credit strength would determine the rate at which the local government could borrow. And in between, there are so many options here. There's some awfully good work done by the World Bank that provides survey evidence of this in countries around the world. I think a lot of it, if you look under the name of Lily Liu, you'll find a lot of that very good survey work.
Related to that, Victor asked about credit rating at the city level versus metropolitan level. For example, Makati versus Manila metro area.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's part of what I mean by we have to think about these things more broadly. You may have a wealthy local government operating within a metropolitan area, and maybe even that wealthy local government would be neighbor to some relatively poor places. So the question becomes, are the fiscal activities of that local government likely to be compromised in any way by the other local governments operating in the metropolitan area? Might the central government, might a Philippine central government pull back on its transfers because there are poor places in the area? Might there not be migration from one area to another? Or maybe some new rules about reasons why local government spending in Makati should be changed. Or maybe what's happening around Makati would affect the extent to which it could continue to attract and grow its own industries. So the analysis of the credit strength of Makati would not be independent of the analysis of what was going on around it and what were the possible implications. Remember, these credit ratings really, what they really are when you grade these local governments is you're asking what's the probability of default? What is the probability that I, the investor, will have timely and full repayment of what I'm due? And so what you want to do is evaluate how any local government would perform under the worst of circumstances. And so I think you couldn't evaluate a Makati by itself.
We have only 4 minutes left, so we are going to take 2 last questions. There's a question from Abdul asking how to improve effectiveness of big central programs, for example, centrally sponsored schemes such as those in India and state-sponsored schemes to support cities.
Yeah, well, oh boy, that's hard, isn't it? I wonder. I almost have to ask a question to answer a question. If we were talking about the schemes in India, and we were talking about the extent to which they played an important role in the efficiency of development of the large cities, I think the first question is whether there was some kind of a metropolitan strategy at the central or at the state level that was guiding the allocation of monies under these schemes. And my impression about India is that that hasn't been the case. The state allocations are very often they're based on resources, of course, but they're partly based on recommendations of a state finance commission. And I haven't seen much by way of a metropolitan strategy embodied in the work of the state finance commissions. So I think the question starts with do the states or does the central government have a metropolitan strategy?
Okay, our last question by Taimur. Can you provide some examples of voluntary revenue sharing instruments in metropolitan areas in developing countries, particularly where some fragmentation remains at the functional or governance levels?
Voluntary revenue sharing?
Yes.
No. Sorry. The word voluntary throws me, but I do not think of local governments that actually would allocate their own revenues voluntarily to other local governments. I think there might be contracting and purchase of services, but I don't come up with examples of that.
Thank you, Roy. Sorry to everyone that we are running out of time and cannot address all the questions, but please feel free to send your questions or comments to my email that will appear in the next screen, and we will try to answer them in the next 2 weeks. I would also like to remind you that our next webinar is on October 15 on Institutions and Politics of Metropolitan Management by Seda Ilma, Senior Economist of the World Bank. We look forward to seeing you again. And in the last screen, there will be an evaluation, and we will appreciate to hear from your comments and feedback to help us improve. Lastly, I would like to thank Professor Roy again for the excellent presentation. Thank everyone for joining us and asking questions. My colleague Victor for organizing this series, and the whole WBS support team, Reza, Brian, Julio, Javier, and Sheila for making this webinar happen. With that, let me hand over to Professor Roy for his final words to conclude the webinar.
Well, my final words are thank you all for coming today. I really enjoyed it. And if you want to get your nose into the detail of this, buy the book. Goodbye.